Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kelly, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Jimmy's senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And sometimes we do these internet Ask Me Anythings with Jimmy, and all the questions come from the internet, and that's what we are doing today. Jimmy, I imagine there are still people on the earth who don't know what you do on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So maybe you could just let them know what they will find if they go to mysterious.fm.
It's a mystery.
That is true. Is that all you want to say?
Well, no, that's what I do. I provide mysteries on Mysterious World. I provide all different kinds of mysteries. Some of them are scientific mysteries. Some of them are historical mysteries. Some of them are true crime mysteries. Some of them are paranormal mysteries. Some of them involve UFOs. Some of them involve Bigfoot. Some of them involve psychic functioning. Some of them involve spiritual, religious mysteries, miracles and biblical mysteries and things like that. So every week we're looking at a different mystery. And unlike a lot of mystery-based shows, we don't just try to generate wonder and get the audience to imagine what if. We actually try to solve the mysteries, and to the extent that that's possible. And we look at them through the twin perspectives of faith and reason. So we say, what would reason tell us about this mystery? And then we say, what would the Christian faith and the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith tell us about this mystery?
Check it out at mysterious.fm, or just type in Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World into your browser, and I'm sure that you will find it. A lot of questions to get to this hour. This one comes from Mephrodus7249. And I assume that's his baptismal name. I don't know. How should we understand the premillennialism of fathers like Irenaeus and Papias, who claim to have received the doctrine from the Apostle John in light of church teaching against Chiliasm?
Chiliasm.
Yeah.
Or if you want to say it the Greek way, Chiliasm. So this is an example of what I would consider claim inflation, because I don't know of any passage in Irenaeus who wrote. He lived in the late 2nd century, so his main writings are dated to about 189 AD or AD 189. Papias lived much earlier in the 2nd century. In fact, he even lived in part of the late 1st century. And it's reported that Papias knew John, and it's reported that Irenaeus briefly knew John when he was a very young man. But I don't know of any passages where either, and there could be one, but I don't know of any, where either Irenaeus or Papias says, John taught me this millennial stuff. Mm-hmm. And so right there, we're looking at a potential case of claim inflation, that just because these men had a connection with John, John must have taught them this. Well, we don't know that. They didn't say that, as far as I can tell. Second point of claim inflation, which John are we talking about? People assume it's John, son of Zebedee, but actually Papias is clear that the John he knows is John the Elder, not John, son of Zebedee. And furthermore, the British scholar Richard Bauckham has made a case, if I'm not misremembering, in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that the John that Irenaeus knew is also John the Elder, not John, son of Zebedee. That may not make much difference, though, if you think, but that could be another case of claim inflation, that we're talking about a more prestigious John than the one they actually knew. Then there's, however, I should say that may not make too much of a difference, though, if you think that it was John the Elder that wrote the book of Revelation, which is where the millennium gets discussed. Then there's the third thing, which is even if, there's no doubt that John, and I would go with John the Elder being the author of Revelation. So but whichever John wrote it, there's no doubt he is a premillennialist because he envisions this future time where Christ and the saints are reigning and the devil is bound so that he can't deceive the nations, and that's in the future to John. The question is it in the future to us? And John didn't know about us. He didn't know when we're going to be living. So you still have to say, well, how should we interpret this? And I would say, well, Irenaeus and Papias may have had misunderstandings. They may have misinterpreted it as being a literal earthly reign of Christ, when that's not actually what the text means, and it's certainly not what the text requires. So I would say that we shouldn't, whereas it's points of data to note that these men had connection with one of the early Johns, and they did happen to be Chiliasts, but that doesn't guarantee that they're right or that John taught the understanding that they have. We simply don't have enough data to be able to establish that. And so the claim is inflated on multiple grounds, because it not only requires that they actually got this teaching from John, it also requires that and from a relevant John, but that they also understood the claim correctly and didn't misinterpret it. And those are three unknowns that we just don't have the data to settle.
Thank you, Mephrodis. Thank you for the question. This one comes from apparently a droid, I'm not sure, SNKRHD13. What can be done to get more Black Americans to convert? All races deserve to know that the Catholic Church is the one that Jesus Christ founded.
Well, I would say the same thing can be done to get more Black Americans to convert as can be done to get people of any ethnic or racial group to convert. Evangelize them. Invite them to go to Mass. Tell them about the Catholic faith. Do apologetics. Address their concerns. Find out what their concerns are. What their stumbling blocks are, and then charitably go through those and resolve them. So I think the same solution. Applies to people of an African American background that applies to people of any background. Having said that, there can be special considerations that can apply to people who have particular backgrounds. One of them here in America is the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion, which is, of course, not true. And I was actually, just the other day, I was noticing an article that argued that myth is something that was influenced by Protestant Christianity rather than Catholic Christianity, because Catholics have always been very open to any child of God, any human being is welcome. And but still, there can be this myth out there that needs to be combated. One way of combating it is pointing to, well, wait, aren't there a bunch of Black churches here in America that are Protestant? Well, yeah, there are. So that would show Christianity is not a white man's religion. And you might want to consider other branches besides the traditionally Protestant Black Catholic churches. The Catholic Church itself is very welcoming to people of all races. And in fact, loads of Black Africans in Africa are converting to the Catholic faith all the time. Catholicism is one of the major forces in the religious scene in Africa, and pointing that out to Black Americans. Hey, a lot of Black Africans actually are becoming Catholic and are very enthusiastic about the Catholic Church. Maybe you'd want to consider that too. That could be something that could be worth pointing out, just like pointing to people in Asia who are becoming Catholic can be helpful for Asian Americans and so forth. One of the things that's not in our control, but that I would love to see in my lifetime, that I think would help both smash the myth that Christianity is a white man's religion, and it would also help potentially various Black Americans to convert, is the election of a pope from sub-Saharan Africa. There have been a number of candidates in recent years, when they were having conclaves, of candidates from Africa who were considered plausible as future popes. A person who's considered a plausible candidate for the pope is called a papabile, someone who's popable. And there have been a number of African cardinals who have been considered papabile in the last few conclaves. I wouldn't be surprised at all at one of them being elected at some point in my own lifetime, and I dearly hope for and look forward to that day.
Thanks very much. That was SNKRHD13. Thanks very much. And also thanks for not making the question be like beep, bop, boop, boop, beep. I think we got to take a quick break. We will be right back with more questions for Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Let us help you with your question today on Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
Catholic Influencers is a great podcast from Australia. It studies the weekly readings and breaks them down into layman's terms, showing you how they're relevant to our life today, making theology accessible for everyone. You can hear Catholic Influencers as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates around the world, all in one place. All free at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click Podcast Central today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Just moving through the questions today, and lots of great questions have come to us via the internet. This one comes from Jacqueline. Do we pray to God to let Mary know our prayer? Do we pray to God to let Mary know our prayers, or do we pray to her directly? If we pray to her directly, what position or posture should our bodies take while asking her to pray for us? Is it just mental knowledge, knowing that we're asking her and praying to God and they are different? Or are there words to say that we should use to make sure we're not committing idolatry?
Okay, so what the Catholic faith holds is that the saints are aware of our prayer requests to them, and then they can intercede for us with God. There's then a speculative question of how do they become aware, and there are different possibilities, but one of the common speculations, which is just a matter of theological opinion, not church teaching, is that God lets them know our prayers. So God is omniscient, he knows everything, so he knows if we're asking the Virgin Mary for our prayers, for her prayers, and then he lets her know, this person would like you to pray for him about this. So even though we may be talking to Mary rather than to God, one way or another, Mary learns about that, and it's commonly thought that it's God who lets her know. So even though we're not directly addressing God, he routes that message to her on this common opinion. In terms of distinguishing this from idolatry, well, you don't need to assume any particular posture with your body when you're talking to Mary versus God. There are no bodily postures that indicate adoration in the proper sense, which is the worship of God that's meant for God alone. There are no bodily postures that signify that. So you can use whatever posture you're comfortable with, and it doesn't have to be any special posture. I mean, I'll be laying in bed and I'm just flat on my back and I'll ask Mary to pray for me. Other times I'll be in a church and I'll put down a kneeler and say Hail Mary or something like that. But it really doesn't matter, because what's important is I know Mary is not a deity. Mary is a human woman. She may be a special human woman, but she's a finite human woman that I'm asking to be my prayer partner in heaven, just like asking a fellow Christian here on earth. to be my prayer partner. And so as long as I'm clear on the fact she's not God, then I'm not committing idolatry any more than if I asked Cy Kellett. I'm pretty clear on the fact he's not God. And if I ask him to pray for me, he's just being my prayer partner, and I'm not at any risk of committing idolatry because I know Cy Kellett ain't a deity. And as long as I know the same thing about Mary, I'm not committing idolatry.
Jacqueline, thank you. The next one, well, I hope this is a colorful question because it comes from CMY.
I noticed you didn't agree that you're not a deity there.
I'm still working that out, Jimmy. I can't even describe to you the depths of the self-delusion I'm capable of. I am still working that out.
Okay,
but
we'll give you some time.
Yeah, no, when you remind me of it, it's good for me. It's good for my spiritual health, but I got to work that out. But I was so excited to say my little joke about I hope this is a colorful question.
Yeah,
from CMYK. Thank you.
Indeed.
0714. Okay, CMYK. I find Eucharistic prayers, number 1 and number 4, especially number 1 in its long form, naming so many saints, linking us more deeply to the history and historicity of the Catholic Church, to be so beautiful and inspiring. Yet today, nearly every priest seems to use number 2, the shortest, and number 3, the most generic, to almost the complete exclusion of numbers 1 and 4. Is it simply the brevity, understandable for daily Mass, and the genericity that makes them favor 2 and 3, or are there other reasons?
Well, I can name one reason off the top of my head, which is that if you look in the Roman Missal, it has advice about which Eucharistic prayers to use on which days. And if memory serves, it tends to associate Eucharistic prayer number 1, which is the one with all the saints mentioned in it. It tends to associate that with major feast days, like, big important ones. And then number 2, it is shorter, and it tends to get used more commonly than number 1. Numbers 3 and 4, I haven't looked into that much, but I believe there's also some guidance about when to use them. Beyond the guidance, and it's just suggestions, it's not requirements, but beyond the guidance that's given in the Roman Missal, I think it's also a matter of personal preference that different priests display. It may to some degree be affected by also their seminary training. Their seminary professors may have told them, use this prayer in this circumstance and this prayer in this other circumstance. But ultimately, you'd have to ask each individual priest why they use these Eucharistic prayers when they do. And I'm sure the answer would vary from one priest to another. One thing that I think may lead to people, and this is just speculation on my part, but actually a couple of things that I think may dispose priests not to use Eucharistic prayer number 1. First, they want to keep it special. And so if you use it all the time, it wouldn't be special. So it may be out of a desire to increase the perception of sacrality or sacredness, to only use this one on special occasions. So when we bring out this Eucharistic prayer, we're communicating this is a really special day. Another thing that could, and this one kind of cuts in a different direction, but another thing that could be behind a tendency not to use Eucharistic prayer number 1 is precisely the thing that you find attractive about it, CMYK. The fact it's got this actually 2 big, massive lists of saints in it, to the exclusion of other things. One, and I just thought of a third reason too, but a lot of people don't know the history of these saints. And so when you hear this list of saints and you're not really familiar with them, then it could make you appreciate it less than if you have a prayer that contains more theological content rather than just a list of names, because people can then think about the theological content that you don't need a background in detailed history of the lives of all these individuals to appreciate. So it may be because most people are not historians, or not, at least hagiographers. They just don't know the lives of these saints that well, and so it doesn't mean as much to them to hear the names of these saints. It's great that you do have a knowledge of them and that you appreciate this and it helps you feel more rooted in history, that's great. But that may not be everybody's experience. The third thing I would say about this is, so Eucharistic prayer number 1 was originally the Eucharistic prayer of the Latin Rite in the pre-Vatican II days. And because of the way it grew over time, there's a whole bunch of options that, in terms of prefaces and little inserts and things like that, that were used before Vatican II in lieu of having other Eucharistic prayers. So that, yeah, we use this core prayer every time, but there were a bunch of options associated with it. And that may be a third reason it's used less today, because navigating all those options is not as easy as with the other 3 prayers. I mean, the others may have a mandate, okay, here's the preface you use, and here's the prayer, and we're done, whereas it can be much more complex with Eucharistic prayer number 1. So those are some speculations, but you'd have to ask individual priests if you wanted a definite answer.
Thank you, CMYK, for the question. This one comes from J. Della Rosa, 89. If I could learn a new language to read the Bible, would it be more beneficial to learn Biblical Greek or ecclesiastical Latin?
Well, it depends on what you want to do with reading the Bible in another language. I mean, we shouldn't limit it to just Greek and Latin. The Latin is a translation. It's not what the Bible is originally written in. So in that sense, knowing it in Latin is like knowing it in Spanish or German or something like that. Well, if you have a reason to read the Bible in Spanish or German, it can be good to learn Spanish and German. If you want to read the Bible in Latin, then learn it in Latin. And just learn it in something you're going to use, because that's what's ultimately useful. What the Greek has as an advantage over the Latin is it's the original language that the New Testament is written in. There's also a translation of the Old Testament in Greek that the New Testament authors used, so it can be useful for that too. But if you want to understand it in the original language, which is useful not just for purposes of Bible reading, but for purposes of exegesis and Bible understanding and trying to figure out the nuances of different passages, then by all means, I'd say learn the original language, which for the New Testament is Greek. You can also learn, and part of the Old Testament is Greek as well as the Septuagint translation. You also could learn Hebrew, and there's even a little bit of Aramaic in the Old Testament. So if you want to learn it for purposes of exegesis and understanding the passage, theologically or in terms of biblical studies or apologetics, I'd say learn the original languages. If you want to learn it in other languages, in translations, for one reason or another, like if you're going to be reading a lot of church documents, well, you'd need Latin for the church documents anyway, well, then learn Latin.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you very much for the question. On we go, because we've got time for another one before we have to take a break, and this one comes from Veronica. I'm just asking a question about Jesus, Mary, maybe Elijah having their bodies in the afterlife. Where? How? I'm guessing there are no definitives, but would like to hear your ideas.
Yeah, well, so there are no definitives here. Traditionally, heaven was conceptualized as the sky. And so if you asked people who are thinking in a sort of pre-philosophical way, where are their bodies? They would say, well, they're up in the sky somewhere, or even above the sky. But that I would view, and Christian theologians have generally viewed, as more of a metaphor to help us understand they are not part of the current material universe that we live in. They're somewhere, quote unquote, higher than where we are. Not physically higher, but the height is a metaphor for a position of greatness and superiority to the world that we live in. I would tend to say, well, they're in another dimension, to use a modern image. Heaven is a place that is not linkable to our physical universe. You can't get in a rocket ship and fly to heaven through physical space. And if you can't reach a location by traveling through physical space, then I would say, well, it's another dimension. So I would say their bodies are in another dimension. And other dimensions can have laws that operate differently than here. So they may not be manifested in 3 dimensions the way our reality is, or they might be manifested in 3 dimensions. What I would say is that whatever dimension they're in, it's at least capable of receiving physical bodies, even if they don't manifest the way our bodies manifest here. And then at the end of the world, when they come back from heaven, their bodies will remanifest the way that our bodies manifest, only they're going to be in an upgraded, glorified condition. So short answer, I'd say they're in another dimension. Beyond that, can't really say too much.
Oh, Veronica, thank you for the question. I hope that was helpful to you. I always love when Jimmy uses the word upgraded because I feel myself much in need of an upgraded body. Looking forward to that very much. I'm not giving out the number today because all of the questions are in, whether they came to Jimmy via his, I think they all came to Jimmy via his social media this time. But if you're like, hey, I want to send in a question for when they do this, you can shoot it to us. radio@catholic.com is our email address, or you can get in touch with Jimmy at one of his social media outlets. We're going to take a very quick break, and we'll be back with lots more questions, lots of great questions to come. Jimmy Akin, our guest. We continue with Ask Me Anything. When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers Monthly Giving Club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
As we read the Gospels, every Christian faces the question again and again, what does Jesus mean? Getting the answer right is critical to both growth in holiness and fruitful evangelization. Want to know Jesus better so you can introduce him to your friends? Then it's time to get serious about understanding his words. Why not join Catholic Answers for our 10th annual Apologetics Conference? Learn from me the parables, sermons, and conversations of Jesus Christ. September 26th through 29th, right here in sunny San Diego. Learn from our guests, Dr. Scott Hahn and Kimberly Hahn, Dr. Ray Garendi, Father Sebastian Walsh, Billy Junker, Father Paul Check, and, of course, all of your favorite Catholic Answers apologists. It'll be 4 days of fun, faith, fellowship, and a live radio show. Seats are still available, but going fast. Visit CatholicAnswersConference.com or call 1-888-291-8000 today. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we've got a whole bunch of questions from the internet forum. And this one comes from Tabitha. And I'll be honest, I've been kind of looking forward to this one. And here's what Tabitha wants to know. From the Catholic perspective, what the heck are fairies? Tabitha, watch your language. We know that humans and angels are separate groups.
The word you were concerned about there was heck and not fairies.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's exactly right. And Tabitha, heck is a perfectly fine word. We know that humans and angels are separate groups of beings with free will. Humans are physical children of God. Angels are non-corporeal beings that do spiritual work for God. But fairies have magic, or at least paranormal powers greater than humans have. They have bodies. They can either be good or evil depending on their will. They're associated with various elements of nature. And they, like aliens, physical beings that God created like he created humans. Oh, are they like aliens, physical beings that God created like he created humans? Or are they spirits that are supposed to work for humans or angels or something completely different?
Well, so the Catholic Church has no teaching on this, so there's not a Catholic perspective on it. There have been lots of Catholics in history who have believed in fairies, as well as other creatures that are neither angel nor human, like elves and trolls and things like that. The specific nature of these creatures is therefore a matter of folk understanding rather than church teaching. And satyrs, that's another one. In fact, both Saint Anthony of the Desert, who claimed to have met a satyr, and Saint Jerome, who wrote about it, believed in satyrs. So there have been a variety of intelligent beings that are not human and not angel that have been reported in Christian history. If we wanted to apply a collective term to them, because they seem to live here on Earth, or at least sometimes live here on Earth, we could call them crypto-terrestrials. Kryptos in Greek means hidden, and so these would be hidden terrestrials, or people who live in hidden places on Earth, like maybe a side pocket dimension or something, and they sometimes cross over here to Earth. The specifics vary from one group to another. Satyrs, for example, only look partly human. From the lower half of their bodies looks like it's an animal rather than a human. Fairies are commonly depicted as looking fully human. They may dress a little more colorfully than regular humans in some traditions, but that's not certain. One of the things that I found, now I have covered fairies or certain fairies in one episode of Mysterious World. If you look up episode 109, I did it on what are known as the Cottingley fairies. In the early 20th century, there were a pair of young girls in England who had access to a camera, and they took photographs of what they claimed were fairies in Cottingley that danced in their garden. And so you can look at the Cottingley fairy photos, and I talk about what I think about that case. What I plan to do in the future, though, is take a broader look at fairies in Christian folklore and look, for example, there's a classic study of the folklore connected with this called the fairy faith of, it's like Great Britain and Northern France and places like that. And it's interesting to see how they're understood. My impression is that they're understood differently by different groups of people, different groups of humans. But the general tendency is to assume that they are physical beings like us. They are very similar to us, but they live in a different realm commonly called fairyland. But they can cross over into our realm, and humans can cross over into their realm. In fact, one of the things, if you're a human, you're not supposed to do in fairyland is eat anything. Because if you eat something in fairyland, you may have to stay there. So I also find it interesting how religion gets handled. There are some accounts where the fairies are not Christian and not redeemable, like fallen angels, but there are other accounts where they seem to want to be Christians and are redeemable. Incidentally, the satyr that Saint Anthony of the Desert reportedly met was professedly Christian, and was a worshiper of Jesus Christ. So that would suggest that some of these other races have free will that continues to be flexible, so they can make good or bad choices during the course of their lifetimes. But there's no Catholic position here. A Catholic could be a firm believer in fairies or other crypto-terrestrials. They could be a firm disbeliever in fairies or other crypto-terrestrials. Personally, I'm rather skeptical of the idea that there are hidden races living here with us, but I'm open in principle, and I find the subject a fascinating one anyway that I'll be covering in the future on Mysterious World.
Tabitha, thank you very much. That was a heck of a good question. This question comes from Music List 4792. Does the church teach that the gods worshipped in pagan religions are demons or just imaginary?
I'd have to say that I don't think the church has a teaching on this. I can't think of any contemporary conciliar or papal. There's no infallible statement on this, and one of the things about non-infallible statements is you have to judge their level of authority based on how, among other things, how frequently they're repeated. And so if you have a non-infallible teaching that has not been repeated in, say 1,500 years, then it's not really authoritative anymore, because the level of authority is correlated with how frequently the teaching is repeated. And if you see a plunge in the repetition of a teaching, it's a sign it may have fallen out of authority, given that it's non-infallible. Infallible teachings never fall out of authority. But there is no infallible teaching on this. What I can say, though, is there is a common understanding based on what is said in Scripture. In the Old Testament, it identifies the gods of the nations in a couple of ways. One of them is as the sons of God. Deuteronomy says that when God apportioned the nations and gave them each their own inheritance, he did so according to the number of the sons of God, which was a term that is used for high-ranking angelic beings. We see the sons of God, for example, in the framing narrative at the beginning of the book of Job, where God comes into his throne room and the sons of God come with him. So according to Deuteronomy and various other passages, God entrusted the nations, the Gentiles, to the sons of God to care for them. So like each nation has its own son of God in charge of it, whereas he kept Israel for himself. Some of these sons of God then go bad, and they start wanting their people to worship them instead of worshiping the true God. Then we see examples of bad sons of God in the book of Daniel, where Daniel has been praying, and 3 weeks later, the angel Gabriel shows up with a revelation, and Gabriel says, sorry, would have been here sooner, but the prince of Persia, that is the son of God in charge of Persia, resisted me. So here we see a son of God resisting one of God's angels, and that indicates he's gone bad. That corresponds to other passages in the New Testament that says, in the Old Testament, that says that the gods of the nations are shadim. Shed in Hebrew is the word for demon, and so saying the sons of God, saying the gods of the nations are shadim, is another way of saying they're demons, and that's something that gets picked up on in the New Testament, which is in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul is talking about Christian worship and pagan worship, and he notes that if you participate in a pagan altar, in worship in a pagan temple, that you're participating in the worship of demons. And so St. Paul also conceptualizes the gods of the nations as demons or fallen created beings. So it's not so much that the gods of the nations don't exist, as they are creatures that, at least for the most part, have gone bad, and we don't want to have anything to do with. If you'd like more information on this, check out episode 112 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on God and the Gods. You can get to it by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin, or by going to mysterious.fm/112.
Thank you very much for the question music list. That brings us to our break. Right back with more questions for Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Proclaiming the faith, changing lives.
The year was 1999. The shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament of Our Lady of the Angels Monastery in Hanceville, Alabama is consecrated. Mother Angelica says the happiest day of my life was the day this church was dedicated.
To learn more about Mother Angelica's life and the history of EWTN, visit EWTN.com/Mother Angelica.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live, where Jimmy is just handling the questions today. We've got questions from the internet and lots. We're very, very good questions, and lots of them answered so far.
There are no bad questions, only bad answers. It's not on the question asker. It's all on me to give a good answer.
Oh, that's a very good point. Well, then you've done a very good job today, because they've all been interesting. This one comes from NightU2160. Does the evidence better support the dormition of Mary, that she was assumed into heaven after her death, or that she was assumed into heaven without experiencing death?
So I'd have to say that I think the evidence better supports the dormition, that she did die before being assumed into heaven. We have multiple accounts of that happening in the Transitist literature in the early church. We don't have any accounts of her being directly assumed into heaven without dying, at least as far as I'm aware. So I would, even though it's not church teaching that she died before being assumed into heaven, I think that that's the option that is, if I'm being honest, that is better supported by the patristic data.
All right. Thank you very much, Night U. This one comes from Dutchman's Mind, 9053. I have heard a theory that the story of Jonah is a fictional, satirical work. I think this is interesting because the moral and purpose of the story effectively remain the same, but I wondered if there were any other implications, and I also wondered what you think of that theory in general.
Well, okay, so there are books in the Bible that are essentially extended parables, and these typically are signaled to the reader in one way or another. For example, the book of Judith is an example of this. So is Tobit. John Paul II thought Esther goes in the same category. In the case of Judith, it's telegraphed really clearly that this is not a standard historical account, because at the beginning of the book, we learn about the conflict between the main character, Judith, whose name means Lady Jew, so she's the personification of Israel, and she's fighting against a general who has been sent by Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians. Well, okay, king of the Assyrians. Everybody in the ancient world knew Nebuchadnezzar was king of the Babylonians, not the Assyrians. But the Babylonians and the Assyrians were the two great enemies of Israel, and they've been fused together here. So Nebuchadnezzar, a Babylonian, is presented as the king of the other great enemy. So this is like if we were to pick up a book or a story and it was about a conflict between Miss America and a general sent by Adolf Hitler, king of the Russians, we would immediately know this is some kind of parable. And so there are parabolic works in the Old Testament. Now, what about Jonah? Well, Jonah is actually not just mentioned in the book of Jonah. He's mentioned elsewhere at least once in one of the historical works. So I think that we have evidence for the historical existence of a prophet named Jonah in this period in history. But that doesn't mean that he can't also be the subject of a parable. And so I think it's possible that Jonah is meant to be a kind of satirical parable story, especially because of elements like the great fish. What would that be? Even you have to ask, what would the ancient reader have thought of that? Could that be a signal that, now they didn't know the difference between whales and fish, so it could be a whale swallowed him, but then is a human really going to be alive in a whale for 3 days? That's harder. And so one could look at that and say that's a signal to the reader that they're not reading straightforward history. And so I'm open to that interpretation. I'm also aware that there have been claims that people did get swallowed by whales. And actually, I've looked into some of those, and they're not as well supported as you might think. And certainly they didn't involve staying alive inside of a whale for 3 days. But I'm open here, but I also don't want to dismiss the idea that this may be based on a historical account. It could well be that it could in fact be somewhere in the middle. You know, if we have evidence Jonah's a real prophet, well, maybe God did send him to Nineveh and he preached and they repented and they didn't get squashed. And that kernel of the story then got built into this more elaborated presentation. Sometimes this kind of literature is called a romana clef. A romana clef is where you have a story that's based on real people. Typically in a romana clef, you change their names, but and that didn't happen here. But this could be a literary presentation of a historical kernel that really did happen. I don't know that we can settle the question rigorously at this point. What I can say is there is a difference between Jonah and the other prophets. If you look at, so Jonah is one of the 12 minor prophets in the ancient world. The 12 was a collection that was circulated as one book. It was called The 12. And Jonah is different than all of the other 12. Jonah is the only one that's presented in a strictly narrative format rather than in an oracular format. If you read the other 12, they're one or more oracles that the prophet received that have been anthologized, whereas with very little surrounding narrative. It may note, oh, this happened in the year of the earthquake or something like that, but just little tiny historical notes like that. In Jonah, the whole thing's narrative with almost no oracles. And that suggests this is a different type of literature, whereas the others are among the 12 are preserved in oracles that were written by the prophets. That's not the case in Jonah. It's written by someone else, and it's got this strange fish story in it. So, and it is very stylized. So maybe it's not literal history, maybe it's an extended parable, or maybe it's a stylized version of something that really did happen historically. But as you say, Dutchman's Mind, the point of the story, the theological truth it teaches is the same either way. God cares about everybody, including Gentiles, and if you repent, God will be merciful.
Thank you, Mr. Mine. Appreciate the question. Getting near the end, on we go to Sal Zapata, 2713. Why do Jews reject Jesus now and even before when he was actually preaching during his ministry? My understanding is because of pride during his time and jealousy, and today because the rabbis keep on hiding the truth from all the people they pray to. All of the prophecies in the Old Testament point to Jesus. Could you elaborate on all prophecies in the Old Testament and the connection to the angel of the Lord, the Son of Man? The Old Testament talks about the Trinity. Why do many still reject Jesus?
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff there, and I'll be able to address it at least briefly. The Old Testament doesn't articulate the doctrine of the Trinity. It contains material that hints at the Trinity, but it's not conclusive. And so thus the Catechism says that the doctrine of the Trinity was not formally revealed until the time of Jesus. So if something is there, but it's in a tentative, partial form, that means there's ambiguity, and that means not everyone's going to see it, because if something's ambiguous, people can take it in different ways, and people will. We do have evidence that there was some recognition in the Second Temple period, which is when Jesus lived at the end of the Second Temple period, that there was some kind of plurality in the Godhead. And this is sometimes called the two powers in heaven doctrine, which actually that name was coined by a Jewish scholar named Alan Segal in his book, The Two Powers in Heaven. But it's been written about by other people. Ultimately, in part, in reaction to Christianity, Orthodox Judaism rejected the two powers in heaven doctrine. And so they turned away from that and insisted on a Unitarian understanding of monotheism rather than a Trinitarian understanding. And that's become a fixed teaching pattern, and that's why most Jews don't accept Jesus, because they've been taught not to. They've been taught, we're Jews, we're not Christians, this is what we believe. And that's really the same answer to why don't most Jews accept Jesus. It's because they've been taught not to. They've been taught to by their parents and their religious leaders and so forth that, we're different than Christians. They believe this, but we believe this other set of beliefs. And that doesn't include regarding Jesus as the Messiah. So that's the basic answer. Now, you mention people during the ministry of Jesus, and you say your understanding is pride and jealousy. Well, that may apply to some Jewish leaders, but it obviously didn't apply to all Jews, because a lot accepted him. The crowds, like at the triumphal entry, regarded him as he's the prophet of Nazareth. So a lot of them did accept Christ, and a lot of them became Christians. And many Jewish people, both in the ancient world and today, have become Christians. What they've not always done is maintained a distinct Jewish identity. And so, there are people who are Christian and have been Christian for generations, but they actually come from Jewish ancestry. They may not even know that. So there's kind of a selection bias in the way the question is posed, because you're not counting all the people who are Jews and are Christians or come from Jewish ancestry and are Christians. You're only looking at the ones who have not become Christian. And among those, the basic answer is it's how they were raised. We don't need to attribute it to malice on the part of anybody, either the individual Jews or their rabbis, their religious leaders. It's just they're repeating what they've been taught, whether they're a rabbi or a Jewish layperson. This is just what we've always been taught. This is how we regard ourselves and who we are.
Thanks, Sal. I'm going to keep moving to try to get as many on as I can, and we do have a little bit of time left. So here comes a question from Rosa. What is the co-redeemer title about? Is it true it is not a dogma yet, not to upset the Protestant communities?
Okay, so the idea is that the title co-redeemer or co-redemptrix should be applied to the Virgin Mary. And the basic idea of this is that Mary cooperated in the work of the Redeemer in a special way. That is, the title, though, is a little misleading in English, because co tends to indicate equality. Like if you have two co-managers for a store, they're equal to each other. That is not what's implied here. Co comes from the Latin word cum, which means with. And so the idea is that Mary cooperated with the work of the Redeemer Jesus in a special way. The same thing, though, is true of all of us. We also cooperate with the work of the Redeemer, for example, by giving a Christian example to others and preaching the gospel to others. So we're all co-redeemers in that sense. Mary, because she was the one through whom Jesus entered the world, she gave birth to him, she cooperated with the work of the Redeemer in a special way. So she could have the title applied to her in a special way. In the mid-20th century, an apparition of Our Lady of the Nations requested that the Pope define this title for Mary, but that has been rejected by the popes. And not just because it would upset Protestants. It would upset Protestants because they would be confused about what does this title mean, but that's not the only reason. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis have all rejected this claim. In fact, the Our Lady of All Nations apparition has been declared non-supernatural. It is not an authentic apparition, according to the Vatican. They recently were very clear about this. When it comes to the title co-redemptrix, Pope Benedict said, it expresses elements of truth, like I just mentioned, the ones it does, but it also goes way beyond the language of Scripture. And it's trying to do too much in too short a space. So it ends up being misleading. And consequently, that's why Pope Benedict and the recent popes have not moved towards infallibly defining this, because it would just mislead a lot of people and be confusing.
Well, thank you, Rosa, and thank you, Internet, for all the questions. We do this from time to time, and as I said, you can get in touch with Jimmy through his social media outlets or just send us an email, radio@catholic.com. We just forward them to Jimmy when they come. If it says question for Jimmy Akin, we just forward it to him, and we'll be happy to do that for you. Jimmy, thank you. Thank you for 2 very fine hours.
My pleasure, Cy Kelly.
And that will do it for us. We'll do it again, God willing, next time right here on Catholic Answers Live.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.